Some historical notes feel like they bridge two worlds, the world of ancient paperwork and the world of the Bible. One of those notes comes from a man named Flavius Josephus. He lived in the same century when Jesus walked the roads of Judea. He wasn't a follower of Jesus. He wasn't part of the young Christian movement. Josephus was a Jewish historian with a priestly background, trained in scripture and public life. That makes what he wrote about Jesus especially interesting. Today we're going to look at who Josephus was, why his writings matter, and what his words tell us about Jesus from a perspective outside the New Testament. If you like calm, fact-focused stories about history and faith, consider subscribing. We'll keep sharing discoveries like this. Flavius Josephus was born in Jerusalem around AD 37, not long after the events of the Gospels. He came from an educated Jewish family and received training in the Scriptures. As a young man he joined the Pharisees, the group that many Gospel accounts show in opposition to Jesus. Later, during the Jewish revolt against Rome, Josephus served as a commander. After surrendering to the Romans, he ended up in Roman service and spent much of his later life in Rome. There he wrote two major works that historians still rely on today, The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus aimed to explain Jewish history and customs to a Greco-Roman audience. He wanted to record events clearly and honestly, and he often wrote for people who did not share his faith or his heritage. That independence is why a passage in Antiquities has captured attention for centuries. In Antiquities, Josephus mentions a man named Jesus. The passage is brief, but the details line up with what the Gospels say. Jesus performed remarkable deeds, taught many people, was put to death under Pontius Pilate, and afterwards his followers claimed he rose on the third day. Josephus also notes that a group called Christians formed around this person, a group that still existed in his time. Why does this matter? Because Josephus was not a Christian. He had no obvious motive to promote the Christian message. He lived close enough in time and place that he would have known about a public figure who attracted crowds and inspired devotion. For someone writing history for Romans and Greeks, Jesus was an event worth noting, whether Josephus believed or not. Important point, scholars debate whether later copyists may have smoothed some lines or added wording that sounds more Christian. Even so, most experts agree that Josephus did write something about Jesus in one form or another. The basic facts, a remarkable teacher crucified under Pilate, whose followers claimed a resurrection, are consistent with other non-Christian sources from that era. That gives us independent historical footing for the existence and impact of Jesus. When we read Josephus alongside the New Testament, a few things are clear. First, Jesus was a real person who made a public impression. He wasn't a myth that developed centuries later. People in the first century, both friends and critics, remembered him. Second, Jesus' life reached beyond a local circle. Josephus reports that both Jews and non-Jews followed him. That matches the gospel picture of crowds from villages and towns coming to listen, and it explains why Roman and Jewish officials took notice. Third, Josephus confirms the core events that the early church proclaimed: public ministry, execution by Roman authority, and a group of followers who continued to worship and spread his name afterward. Those are facts that make the gospel accounts look less like late inventions and more like reports built on real events. Fourth, the passage shows that belief in Jesus was not a private matter. By Josephus' day, a whole group, Christians, existed and identified by his name. That kind of organized following tends to grow out of something that actually happened, not from pure legend. Josephus is not alone in providing non-Christian testimony. Roman writers such as Tacitus and Suetonius also mention either Christ or the early Christians in their histories, noting persecution and the fact that the movement had a founder who suffered under Pontius Pilate. The consistency across these independent sources strengthens the historical case. When multiple writers from different backgrounds, Jewish and Roman, believer and skeptic, all point to similar core facts, historians take notice. They don't treat those facts as proof of faith on their own, but they do treat them as reliable data about what was happening. If you are a person of faith, Josephus' mention is encouraging. It shows that non-Christian history recognized Jesus and his followers. That can feel like a bridge between religious memory and secular history. If you are a historian or someone skeptical of religious claims, Josephus is useful too, not because he proves doctrines, but because he provides independent testimony about important events. His writings help scholars reconstruct what the first-century world looked like and how early Christianity began to spread. Either way, Josephus invites honest conversation. He doesn't force belief, and his account doesn't answer every question. What it does do is make the gospel story part of the broader historical record. A balanced view needs caution. Josephus was writing decades after the crucifixion. He relied on oral reports and earlier records. Scribes later copying manuscripts could have altered the text, sometimes adding clearer Christian phrasing. Scholars work carefully to separate what Josephus probably wrote from later editorial additions. Still, even a conservative reading, one that removes the most Christian-sounding lines, leaves us with a meaningful mention of Jesus. The presence of that core reference is the key point. Also, Josephus was not writing theology. He was a historian who reported events as he understood them. The theological claims of the Gospels seller, for example, that Jesus is God, are matters of faith and interpretation. Josephus offers historical witness. He does not substitute for religious conviction. The New Testament writers were eyewitnesses or close to eyewitnesses. Their testimony centers on Jesus' life, teaching, death, and resurrection. Josephus and other ancient writers provide a different kind of testimony, external confirmation that people were talking about Jesus, that he confronted authorities, that he had followers who continued after his death. When you place these two kinds of testimony together, the internal witness of believers and the external notes of historians, the picture becomes richer. The Gospels describe the spiritual meaning. Josephus and Roman writers describe public events. Together they form a fuller portrait of a man who changed the course of history. Historians value Josephus because he wrote close to the time of the events he describes. He had access to traditions, eyewitnesses, and records that later generations did not. He also had reasons to be careful. As a Roman patronage-supported writer, his credibility mattered. If he exaggerated, his Roman audience would notice. That's why his passing reference to Jesus carries weight. It fits the prudence and tone of his broader history. Josephus was not trying to prove that Jesus was divine. He was a chronicler doing his best to record people and events that mattered in his day. For modern readers, his short note about Jesus does something powerful. It reminds us that the story of Jesus did not begin in a vacuum. It unfolded in a world full of people, politics, and history, and those people recorded what they saw. If you stand in a museum of first-century artifacts or read Josephus' lines yourself, you are connecting with that distant world. You are hearing a voice that says, "Something happened here that made people believe and gather and tell the story to others." Whether you come to faith because of that fact, or whether you simply appreciate the historical puzzle, Josephus gives us a doorway into the past.